Mr.
The clerk will
Chairman,
designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2623, offered by Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would exempt regulations regarding sexual harassment from this bill, and I think members on both sides will find my amendment especially timely, as Congress is under great criticism to make sure that we eliminate sexual harassment from our own chambers. As you know, Mr. Chairman, the bill would codify the President, that you've put forward, codifies the President's executive orders that require offsetting the number and costs of regulations. That's interesting, since there has been no work to be done on what the implications of these regulations. And before that's done, and before there have been any hearings by this committee, we're already trying to codify it. Last time I looked, we didn't codify things before having hearings on it. So this is a great leap into the unknown. Because this bill, like the President's executive orders, arbitrarily establishes that for every new regulation to existing, and by the way, potentially unrelated regulations must be repealed. And the costs of any new regulation must be offset by repealing existing regulations that impose a cost of an equal or greater amount. Surely we can agree that it is very difficult. In fact, I would defy any member to tell me what the cost is of some of the sexual harassment we've been hearing about in the Congress and elsewhere. Important rules and regulations that serve to investigate and enforce laws, it should not be subject to repeal willy-nilly under an arbitrary in and out, one in, two out, or no new costs. Indeed, I thought that what we went through yesterday was a promise. It said everybody went to the bill saying we're on the first step to eliminate sexual harassment from this body with this small step of training and posting. And we were all assured that this was the first step, and we better had been assured, because there's been a public outcry against sexual harassment in the Congress. This increased attention to the number of claims of sexual harassment around the country today, including in the Congress, deserves Congress to do more. And this, the day after we were on the floor unanimously approving the posting and training bill, this first opportunity, we are doing exactly the opposite of what we promised. And that is, instead of doing more to make sure that there is less sexual harassment, we are guaranteeing that we will not be able to undercover much sexual harassment, and that the government is not doing everything possible, as we promised, to rid this body of sexual harassment, certainly arbitrarily repealing rules that serve to provide a workplace free of sexual harassment would go in the opposite direction of what we promised today. So how do we do what this bill is requiring? The costs of new regulations are considered when determining offsets. How do you offset when a woman comes forward or a man comes forward and says, I've been subject to sexual harassment? How would you offset a regulation that allowed that to happen? We know this from the Congressional Research Service, and I'm quoting, measuring costs without also considering benefits does not provide the complete context for evaluating the appropriateness of the country's amount of regulation, end quote. I would think that that goes double and triple for sexual harassment. For example, while we know that there may be costs associated with implementing new rules to deter sexual harassment, I can't think of what they are, but I'm sure there are some. How can we possibly calculate the monetary value of having a workplace free from sexual harassment? This body is going to pay the price for allowing sexual harassment to thrive here, and this bill is going to make it very hard to show we are serious about ridding this body of sexual harassment. I appreciate the committee's consideration of my adoption, and I urge its my amendment, I'm sorry, and I urge its adoption.
I thank the gentlewoman. It is the gentlewoman yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I've been asked, and I ask unanimous consent to add Brenda Lawrence, who wishes to be a co-sponsor of my amendment.
I would like to also be.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now
Two other
recognizes.
members have asked to be co-sponsors.
So you're asking a unanimous consent,
I am asking unanimous consent.
and those two members are who for the clerk?
I would like to be a co-sponsor.
And also,
So could the gentlewoman restate her unanimous consent request?
I ask, Mr. Chairman, that Ms. Maloney and Mr. Lynch be added as co-sponsors.
And Mr. Cummings.
And I ask that Mr. Cummings be added as well.
Robin Kelly.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yes, I'm sorry, who is?
The chair is willing to put all Democrats on as co-sponsors if that's your request.
Thank you
So,
for your generosity, Mr.
all
Cummings.
right, so without objection, all Democrats present are co-sponsors of your amendment. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment. As the gentlewoman knows, I mean, it was a unified effort to stand against sexual harassment. However, this bill would not prohibit any rulemaking. It actually deals with major rules. And so, you know, the whole premise on which the gentlewoman offers her amendment actually misses the very context of the underlying bill. This amendment that you have provided actually would provide a harmful exemption to the transparency and reform in HR 2623 for regulations related to sexual harassment. The amendment would actually also allow agencies to hide changes to sexual harassment regulations by omitting them from the semi-annual unified agenda. And further, the amendment would also prohibit a department from counting its consolidation and updating of sexual harassment regulations across multiple agencies as deregulations. One-off exceptions to this bill, such as this amendment, will not protect those regulations. In fact, I believe it will stagnate them. So now more than ever, we have to ensure that the government has policies to protect federal employees, and therefore I would oppose this amendment, but I appreciate the spirit in which the amendment was offered, and I encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Is there anyone else wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield to Ms. Norton to respond to what you just said.
First, I have a parliamentary inquiry. You began by saying, Mr. Chairman, that sexual harassment was not a major rule. In what way?
Would the gentlewoman state her parliamentary inquiry?
Why does the chairman believe that the sexual harassment, a sexual harassment?
As defined by statute, I mean, well, I don't know that the gentlewoman is expressing a parliamentary inquiry. If the gentlewoman's recognized, if she wants to make a point.
Well, could I simply ask the chairman a question? I want, since it came from you, Mr. Chairman, what did you mean when you said sexual harassment is not a major rule, would not be a major rule? I took it down, your words.
So would the gentlewoman yield?
I'm glad to
Okay,
hear.
so under statute, when we're looking at this, they have to have an annual effect on the economy of $100 million and more adversely in a material way. And as the gentlewoman knows, that we've had hearings before this particular committee where very substantial regulations do not meet that particular economic threshold. And so that in that, the regulation would actually have to meet a $100 million threshold adversely affecting it. So that was the context in which I offered that. And so that's, I would yield
For
back.
reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, in that effect, you're essentially saying this does not add to the cost of government, and I'm wondering why this amendment, my amendment that would allow sexual harassment rules and amendments to stand, it being of so little cost. You've also you found apparently without, and I don't know how you found it, but you found it certainly wouldn't amount to $100 million. And I wonder why it's necessary, therefore, to vote against my amendment.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I support this amendment offered by my colleague, Ms. Norton. This amendment would exempt from Section 5 of the bill any rule related to sexual harassment. Under this bill, the Office of Personnel Management, Office of Special Counsel, Department of Defense, or any other agency could be prohibited from issuing a rule to prohibit sexual harassment if the estimated cost of the rule was more than the regulatory budget allocated by the Director of OMB for that year. Sexual harassment is an issue, and we must all take it very seriously. So I urge members to show they take this issue seriously by supporting this amendment. And with that, I'll yield back.
Wait a minute.
I'll yield to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
I strongly support my colleague's amendment and the ranking member's statements. And sexual harassment is a crime. It's a serious crime. Often the victims and the perpetrators never recover from the experience. It is a very serious crime, and while the whole nation, for the first time in my life, is taking this crime seriously, this committee is offhandedly dismissing it as something that's not important, should not be included. I think it's an outrage. I think you are a better person than how you're acting now on this amendment. And I hope the chairman will reconsider and support Mrs. Norton's amendment. She is a lawyer who dedicated her life helping people, not before she got elected to Congress, and as in the Office of Equal Employment, protecting them from harassment, from discrimination. She feels deeply and strongly. I admire her work. We should support her. It's important to women across this country today and in the future. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to give this consideration to the women of this country. I yield back to the ranking member.
Yeah, I want to just ask Ms. Norton. Ms. Norton, I take it that it was your intent to try to make sure that we kept rules in place that would affect women in the workplace. Is that right?
Well, that is certainly my intent, and if I may say, Mr. Chairman, we were promised that we were at the beginning of a process. So there may be some rules in place now, but if this bill passes, the Congress will not be able to enact new sexual harassment rules without showing that we're getting rid of two unrelated, perhaps, rules, or costing the government more than $100 million. Mr. I just want to say, part of my concern about this, I think the majority might have been able to enact this rule had it had hearings, but we're voting in the blind on a matter. And I raised this particular amendment because perhaps it's the most sensitive matter, the one that is still under advisement by the Congress of the United States, and yet we are nullifying any possibility of new sexual harassment rules and regulations with a vote against my amendment, if we do indeed vote against it.
I see my time has expired. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for her heart in this particular issue. I would remind her that workplace requirements and contingencies and rules and regulations are outside the scope of this bill. And when we really look at that, if the desire is for the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia to work for this in a meaningful way, she will find no one more committed to doing that than myself. I will pledge that. If she's willing to withdraw her amendment, here's what I'm willing to do, is to work, and she knows that she can take me at my word. Not only work specifically to make sure that there is no inadvertent adverse effect in this bill as we look at this, but also work individually with the gentlewoman on making sure that we get this addressed for protection across all federal workplaces in the most sincere and direct way. But I offer that to the gentlewoman, and I'm not going to ask her for any comment other than, is there anyone else who would like to speak on the gentlewoman's amendment? Hearing none. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No, and Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Amendment offered by the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Meadows.
No.
Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes no. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Sanford. Mr. Amash. Mr. Amash votes no. Mr. Gosar. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Farenthold. Mr. Farenthold votes no. Ms. Fox. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker votes nay. Mr. Blum. Mr. Blum votes no. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Gianforte. Mr. Gianforte votes no.